ARK Invest predicts Bitcoin will be worth $2.4 million in 2030.
If America's buying Bitcoin, we're buying Bitcoin.
I defend your right to buy Bitcoin. Go at it.
Something silent is happening at the heart of the global financial system. It's not a new crisis, nor a trade war. It's more subtle than that. A code, written just over a decade ago, is slowly infiltrating the foundations of the world economy. Discrete, decentralized, praised by some, ignored by others, and fought by many. Its name? Bitcoin. For a long time, it was seen as a digital curiosity, an experiment, a mathematical protest against central banks and their unchecked decisions. But time passed, economic cycles shifted, and Bitcoin remained. It grew, and now, more than ever, it's starting to look less like an anomaly and more like a symptom of something greater, the erosion of trust in traditional currencies. The dollar still reigns, but its pillars are trembling. Inflation, industrial-scale money printing, currency wars, and political sanctions have turned the global monetary system into a geopolitical roulette. In this scenario, a currency that belongs to no country, that cannot be manipulated by governments, starts to seem not just viable, but necessary. This video is an invitation to look beyond the headlines and try to understand what's really at stake. It's not about predicting the price of Bitcoin tomorrow. It's about imagining a world where it silently becomes the foundation of a new financial system, one without borders, without central banks, and perhaps with no way back. In 2008, while banks collapsed under the weight of their own insane bets and governments injected trillions to bail them out, someone, or some group, decided to write a response. Not an article, not a street protest, but a code, a protocol, an alternative financial system built outside institutions, beyond state control, and out of reach of any central banker's pen. Bitcoin was born, along with a 9-page white paper and an idea that seemed too simple to be taken seriously. A digital currency, decentralized, with no intermediaries, based on peer-to-peer trust and protected by cryptography, signed by someone called Satoshi Nakamoto, a name that, to this day, no one knows for sure whether it belongs to a person, a group, or a carefully cultivated myth. But Bitcoin's birth wasn't just technical, it was symbolic. The message embedded in the first mined block. The Times March 1st, 2009 Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks is anything but neutral. It's a statement, a manifesto in the form of a data block. The choice of that phrase wasn't random. It was the headline of the British newspaper, The Times, on that day. And its inclusion serves as a clear message to the global financial system. While central banks reaffirmed their authority by printing more money to save the guilty, Bitcoin emerged as an alternative that said, "We don't need you anymore." Bitcoin's code established the foundation for a currency with immutable rules. The main one: there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins. No more, no less. This alone is a slap in the face to the modern fiat system, based on flexibility, or rather, on monetary manipulation disguised as economic policy. In practice, Bitcoin is a direct attack on the heart of state monetary sovereignty. After all, if anyone, anywhere in the world, can store and transfer value without relying on banks, governments, or clearing systems, then what's the point of the entire global financial structure? Of course, in the early years, no one took it seriously. Traditional economists mocked its volatility. Banks ignored or ridiculed it. And the general public associated the word Bitcoin with two things: fanatical geeks and dark web drug markets. The currency's reputation was, for a long time, closer to a B-grade sci-fi movie than a trustworthy financial asset. But there was something there, a core of resistance. Developers, enthusiasts, and idealists who kept working, refining the code, expanding the network. And most importantly, they didn't ask anyone's permission. This structure with no center, no CEO, no headquarters, almost a living organism, resistant to censorship and adaptable to attack, started to draw attention. Not as a day-to-day currency, but as an asset with unique properties: program scarcity, immutability, auditability. It was, in essence, the anti-dollar. Economist Friedrich Hayek, decades before Bitcoin, had already suggested that the only way to take the monopoly of money away from the state would be to find a form of money it couldn't stop. Well, Hayek died in 1992. In 2009, his prophecy gained source code. Bitcoin didn't ask for permission to exist. And maybe that's why it bothers so many, because the more it grows, the more it reveals that the problem isn't just the system. It's the fact that we've accepted for so long that there was no alternative. This is just the beginning of the story. A code against the empire. Every revolutionary technology is born underestimated. The airplane, the combustion engine, the internet, and of course, digital money. When Bitcoin appeared, it was immediately placed on the shelf of tech oddities, alongside the Segway, Google Glass, and ovens that talk to you. In the early years, it was worth less than a bad cup of coffee and was treated with equal disdain. But there was something unsettling about that open source code that refused to die. And that's when the cycles began. With each new speculative bubble, Bitcoin would explode in value, make headlines, attract crowds, and then crash. In 2011, it went from a few cents to $30, then fell to $2. In 2013, it broke past $1,000. Crashed again. In 2017, it neared $20,000. Crashed once more. In 2021, it went beyond $60,000, and as tradition dictates, plunged again soon after. These fluctuations are not bugs. They are filters. Each cycle separates adventurers from the committed. Speculators come for quick profit. Holders stay, not because they're masochists, but because they understand what's at stake. A monetary transformation without precedent. And that's where Bitcoin starts to take on the shape of a dogma. Not in the sense of blind faith, although for some, it has almost become a religion, but in a philosophical sense. Bitcoin became a living manifesto, a silent protest against chronic inflation, the erosion of purchasing power, and institutionalized monetary manipulation. While critics kept hammering on volatility, as if that were an unforgivable flaw in a nascent monetary system, defenders argued that the real risk isn't in Bitcoin, but in the system we've come to accept as normal. In 2021, when the US government approved trillions in stimulus packages, many looked at Bitcoin and thought, maybe that thing makes sense. After all, a currency that cannot be inflated at will starts to look appealing when traditional money loses value faster than it can be spent. Companies began buying Bitcoin as protection against cash devaluation. MicroStrategy led the way. Tesla joined in. Banks that once mocked it began offering custody services to institutional clients. Even figures like Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, who once dismissed the crypto asset, began to change their tune. The irony is almost poetic. The system that tried to ignore Bitcoin ended up, little by little, being forced to absorb it. Of course, not everything is consensus. For many economists, Bitcoin is still a highly speculative asset, unfit for use as a daily currency. Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize winner, even compared it to a technological fairy tale. But the data tells another story. Adoption is growing, not just in developed countries, but especially in fragile economies, where trusting the government or the local currency is an ill-advised act of faith. In Nigeria, Argentina, Venezuela, places where inflation has turned money into decorative paper, Bitcoin has become more than an investment. It became a lifeline, a plan B, a survival currency. And this is where things shift. Because when millions of people around the world begin using a currency that belongs to no government, something bigger is happening. It's no longer about price, it's about purpose. If once Bitcoin was just an eccentric asset, today it's a symbol of cultural change, a sign that trust in institutions is crumbling and that people are willing to seek alternatives, even if those alternatives are still technically imperfect. Dogma or not, one thing is certain: Bitcoin is no longer a joke, and the more the system tries to contain or regulate it, the stronger it gets, not by magic, but by logic. Because in the end, trusting code is less risky than trusting politicians. And that simple realization, repeated in silence by millions of users, is what's paving the way for the next phase of this story. You don't need to be a macroeconomics genius to notice something is deeply wrong with money. Just go grocery shopping for a few weeks. In recent years, the world has witnessed a recurring spectacle. Central banks printing trillions, governments spending without restraint, and inflation reappearing like a foul-smelling old acquaintance after decades of apparent control. The official narrative talks about temporary shocks and transitory adjustments, but people's wallets tell another story. The 2008 crisis was the warning sign. The 2020 pandemic was the final push. And since then, global monetary policy has turned into a kind of desperate alchemy. Negative interest rates, infinite stimulus, bond buybacks, and a technical vocabulary that basically serves to hide the fact that we're stacking debt on top of debt, with no clear plan of how or when it'll be resolved. Today, the United States owes more than $34 trillion. Japan owes over 260% of its GDP. Europe is facing an energy and demographic crisis, and the trust that held it all together, the so-called faith in money, is starting to show cracks. That's where Bitcoin comes in, not as a hero, but as a consequence. Because when a currency like the dollar depends increasingly on politics and less on productive reality, it stops being a reference point and starts behaving like a soap bubble. Shiny, pretty, but unstable and fragile. The modern fiat system runs on a promise. Trust us, we know what we're doing. But that trust is being eroded, not by libertarian ideologies, but by the institutional actors themselves. When central banks become hostages of political decisions and governments rack up debt to buy votes or put out economic fires, the value of money becomes a matter of faith. And faith, as we know, is volatile. The crisis isn't just monetary, it's geopolitical. The international order built around the dollar as the global reserve currency is being challenged. Sanctions imposed by the US and Europe on Russia, for example, sent a clear message. Your reserves, your assets, your international transactions, all of it can be frozen overnight, depending on who's in charge. Countries like China, India, Iran, and even Brazil have started looking for alternatives. Local currency payments, bilateral agreements outside the SWIFT system, and of course, a timid but growing adoption of cryptocurrencies as a bypass mechanism. Not because they love Bitcoin, but because they're tired of playing a game where the rules change based on the winner's interests. In this context, Bitcoin represents more than a currency. It represents a parallel architecture of trust, a network where consensus doesn't depend on political treaties, but on open source code, mathematical transparency, and clear economic incentives. The irony is that the more unstable the traditional system becomes, the more attractive Bitcoin looks. It doesn't need to be perfect to compete. It just needs to survive the chaos. And so far, it has done that with surprising resilience. The collapse of the old system won't be sudden. It will be gradual, but it has already begun. And as Ernest Hemingway once said when asked how he went bankrupt, 2 ways, gradually, then suddenly. The monetary shift underway isn't driven by bullets, but by blocks of data. There are no tanks in the streets, no revolution live-streamed on TV. Bit by bit, Bitcoin is ceasing to be just a store of value for enthusiasts and becoming a quiet infrastructure that fits into the cracks of the global system. In countries where money fails, it's used out of necessity. In countries where money works, it's kept as a hedge. In both, the standard is shifting. This transition is unlike anything we've ever seen, because Bitcoin doesn't need to be declared global currency by any government. It just needs to be accepted by individuals, companies, and eventually, nations. It doesn't require treaties. It doesn't require wars. It only requires that it continues to work better than the alternatives in certain contexts, and it's already starting to do that. In El Salvador, Bitcoin became legal tender, not out of ideological stubbornness, but out of pragmatism. The country doesn't have its own central bank. It uses the dollar. And it saw in the cryptocurrency a chance to escape total dependence on Washington. The experiment is ongoing, with flaws, of course, but the symbol has already been launched. In parts of Africa, like Nigeria, Bitcoin is growing not as a luxury, but as a survival tool, where the banking system is restricted, censored, or simply dysfunctional. A digital wallet on a phone offers more freedom than any brick-and-mortar bank could. Behind the scenes, major financial institutions, Those that once called Bitcoin a fraud are adapting. Bitcoin ETFs are being approved. Banks are creating crypto custody divisions. Institutional investors are starting to treat the asset not as a curiosity, but as a structural part of the new financial architecture. Even CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, which promise to digitize state money, end up validating Bitcoin's thesis because they show that the money we knew is already obsolete. The difference is that while CBDCs maintain centralized control, Bitcoin hands the keys to the user. Little by little, a new kind of global monetary coexistence is being built. A currency that belongs to no flag, that doesn't depend on trust in politicians, banks, or multilateral organizations, that survives censorship, sanctions, collapses, and hyperinflation. This doesn't mean Bitcoin will replace all national currencies. It can coexist with them. It can serve as a reserve, as a basis for international contracts, as modern collateral for agreements between countries that no longer want to depend on the dollar or the yuan. It can be, in the words of economist Lynn Alden, an ideal settlement layer in a multipolar world. And maybe that's the most plausible scenario for 2050, a world where Bitcoin doesn't dominate, but structures, where it doesn't need the official label of global currency because it's already playing that role in practice, where its stateless nature makes it, paradoxically, the most universal candidate. Because in the end, Bitcoin is a currency that no one controls, and precisely because of that, it may be the only one everyone accepts. Humanity has always sought something to represent value: shells, salt, gold, paper. But all these forms of money depended on an authority, an empire, a centralized belief. Bitcoin breaks that logic. It is the first currency with no king, no borders, no censorship. Maybe that's why so many still fear it, and at the same time, bet on it. You might think it's just a bubble, or you might see what's coming, a future where trust isn't printed, it's programmed. If this video made sense to you, share it with someone who still thinks Bitcoin is just for buying drugs on the dark web. Leave a comment saying where you think we'll be in 2050, using dollars, satoshis, or microchips implanted in the back of our hands. Oh, and of course, subscribe to the channel. Here, we talk about technology, economics, and geopolitics to better understand this real-life Game of Thrones. See you in the future.